Somewhere in a museum storage drawer in Germany, France, Belgium, or Britain, there is very likely a small bronze object sitting in the dark that nobody working there can tell you the purpose of. Not because a label is missing, because after more than 200 years of digging over 100 of these things out of the ground, no historian, no archaeologist, and no Roman text has ever explained what they were actually for. It has 12 flat faces. It has a hole punched through the center of every single one, and every hole is a different size. At each of the 20 corners sits a small round knob. Hold it up and you can see straight through it, empty and hollow inside. It looks like a toy. It looks like a piece of jewelry for a giant. And it had become one of the strangest unsolved puzzles sitting quietly in plain sight in museums across Europe. Because the honest answer, the answer actual archaeologists give when you ask them directly, is that they do not know. And today we're going to go through exactly why that is, what these things really are, what we've actually tried to figure it out, and why the silence around them might be the most interesting part of the entire mystery. Let's start with the object itself, because the actual, verified shape is strange enough without adding anything to it. A Roman dodecahedron is a small hollow bronze shape, usually somewhere between 4 and 11 centimeters across, so small enough to sit comfortably in your palm. It has 12 faces, and each face is a pentagon, a 5-sided shape. That's where the name comes from, dodeca, 12, hedron, faces. In the middle of every pentagon is a circular hole, and here's a detail that always catches people off guard the first time they see one up close. The 12 holes are not the same size. Some are wide enough to fit 2 fingers through. Others are barely big enough for a pencil. At the 20 points where the pentagon faces meet each other, there's a small knob, like a tiny bronze bowl sitting on a stub. Every dodecahedron ever found has the same basic layout. 12 pentagon faces, a hole in each one, 20 knobs at the corners, and a hollow center you can see straight through. More than 100 of these objects have been recovered since the first one was documented in the 1700s, and the location pattern is genuinely one of the most consistent things about them. They almost never turn up in Italy, the heart of the Roman Empire. Instead, they are found scattered across the northwestern provinces, what's now France, Germany, Switzerland, Belgium, the Netherlands, and a handful in Britain. These were the frontier regions, the border zones where Roman territory pushed up against Gaul and Germania, garrison country, the cold and wet edge of the empire rather than its warm Mediterranean core. That geographic pattern alone has fueled 100 years of speculation, because whatever these things were for, it seems to have mattered specifically to the people living and working in those particular provinces, not to Rome as a whole. And then there's a detail that turns this from a curiosity into a genuine historical puzzle. The Romans, as a civilization, wrote an enormous amount down. We have Roman engineering manuals describing how to build roads and aqueducts. We have military treatises. We have personal letters between soldiers stationed on the frontier, complaining about socks and asking their families to send more beer. We have tax records, inventories, shopping lists, and gravestones with detailed biographies carved into them. The Romans were prolific record keepers by the standards of the ancient world. And yet, across all of that surviving material, spanning centuries, there is not one confirmed written reference to these objects. No name for them survives, if they ever had one. No instructions. No mention in a military inventory. No line in a letter saying, "Send me one of those bronze things." For an object that took real time and bronze casting skill to produce, and that shows up in more than 100 separate archaeological finds, that silence is unusual, and it's the main reason these objects remain unexplained rather than simply forgotten. So naturally, over the last 2 centuries, people have proposed a long list of theories, and it's worth going through the honest, real candidates rather than inventing new ones, because the actual list is interesting enough on its own. The oldest theory is that there was some kind of measuring or surveying tool, maybe used to gauge distances or check the alignment of things like pipes or poles, using the graduated holes as a kind of built-in ruler. This idea has been around since the 1800s, but it's never been demonstrated convincingly, and one obvious problem is that far simpler, more accurate measuring tools existed in the Roman world, and we have plenty of evidence of those. Another long-running theory is that it was a candlestick holder, with a candle sitting in one of the openings and the knobs functioning as feet to prop it up. This is one of the oldest guesses, going back to some of the earliest antiquarians who found these objects, but it is a real problem. None of the surviving dodecahedra show soot marks, wax residue, or heat damage on the interior, which is exactly what you'd expect if they had regularly held a burning flame, but a more modern and genuinely interesting theory, one that has actual experimental support behind it, is that the object was used as a tool for knitting gloves, specifically for making the fingers. In 2014, a Dutch researcher and knitting enthusiast named Bernard van Dalen ran a real experiment where he used a similar-shaped object with graduated holes to knit small woolen tubes, essentially finger-shaped cylinders. By looping yarn around the knobs and working through the holes, he was able to produce a usable glove finger this way. This theory has gotten attention precisely because someone actually tested it, rather than just speculating, and it does account for the graduated hole sizes, since different hole sizes would produce different tube diameters, matching the tapering shape of fingers. It's one of the more credible proposals, though it still doesn't explain why these tools cluster specifically along the frontier, or why, if it were a common household knitting tool, it left no trace anywhere in Roman textile records or artwork. There are other suggestions too. A die or gaming piece used in some kind of gambling or divination game, a decorative scepter head or ceremonial object tied to a religious or military cult, a candle holder variant used specifically as a votive or grave offering rather than for daily lighting, and a range-finding tool that soldiers might have used to estimate distances on a battlefield by sighting through the holes. Each of these have been argued by someone in the academic literature at some point, and each one runs into the same basic wall. There's no definitive evidence connecting the object convincingly to any single one of these uses, and multiple explanations can each account for part of the design without accounting for all of it. What actually makes archaeologists cautious about jumping to any single answer is the pattern of where these objects are found. A significant number of them have been recovered specifically from what are called hoards, buried collections of valuable items, often bronze coins, jewelry, and tools, stashed together, sometimes for safekeeping and sometimes as a ritual deposit. Others have turned up in graves, buried alongside the dead. Still others were simply found in general settlement debris, the ordinary leftover material of daily Roman life. That spread, hoards, graves, and everyday rubbish actually works against any single simple explanation, because a purely practical tool used every day would usually turn up mostly in domestic contexts, while a purely ceremonial or symbolic object would usually turn up mostly in ritual or funerary contexts. These objects show up in both, which suggests either that they serve more than one purpose depending on the owner, or that whatever function they had also carried enough personal or symbolic value that people chose to bury them with the dead or tuck them away in a hoard for safekeeping. That there's also the physical evidence about how they were made, and this part is well documented without needing to exaggerate it. They were cast in bronze, likely using a lost wax casting method, which was a well-established Roman metalworking technique. Casting an object with as many identical-looking faces and consistently placed knobs would have required a genuinely skilled bronze caster, someone experienced enough to produce clean, symmetrical castings by hand and eye, using techniques and tools that, by Roman standards, were already advanced. That doesn't require any lost or forgotten science. Roman bronze casting was a mature, well-practiced craft by the time these were being made, generally dated to somewhere between the 2nd and 4th centuries AD, and skilled Roman metalworkers routinely produced detailed, symmetrical bronze objects for coins, statuary, and military equipment. What makes the dodecahedron stand out isn't that the casting itself is beyond Roman capability. It's that we don't have a clear record of why they bothered making this particular, oddly specific shape over and over in such geographically concentrated locations, for what appears to have been at least a couple of centuries. It's also worth being honest about what we don't have, because that's really the heart of the mystery rather than anything supernatural or dramatic. We don't have a Roman name for the object. We don't have Roman artwork clearly depicting someone using one. We don't have a workshop site where large numbers of them were manufactured, with tools and molds still in place, the way we sometimes get lucky finding pottery kilns or glassworking sites. We don't have a single ancient text in any language from the period that unambiguously refers to this shape and explains its purpose. Everything we have is the object itself, the place it was found, and the object it was found near. That's a real archaeological problem, and it's exactly the kind of problem that keeps this particular object interesting after 2 centuries, rather than filed away and forgotten. Most everyday Roman objects, even unusual ones, eventually get explained once enough examples turn up in enough contexts. The dodecahedron has resisted that process for an unusually long time. One thing that is fair to say, and that a number of serious researchers have pointed out, is that the true answer might not be a single answer at all. It's entirely possible that different workshops in different provinces over a couple of centuries made variations of a shape that had become locally traditional or symbolically meaningful, and that different owners used them for different things. Some as a genuinely practical tool, some as a decorative or status object, some as something with religious or superstitious meaning tied to local frontier culture. A kind of blending between Roman craftsmanship and the beliefs of the Gallic and Germanic peoples living in and around those border provinces. That kind of layered, regional answer isn't as dramatic as a single grand solution, but it's a kind of explanation that actually fits real archaeological patterns, where objects often carry more than one meaning depending on who owned them. So where does that leave us? Genuinely unresolved, and that's the honest headline here rather than a manufactured one. The Roman Dodecahedron is a real, well-documented, beautifully made bronze object. Over 100 of them exist. They cluster specifically along the old northwestern frontier of the Roman Empire. They show real skill in their casting. And despite 2.5 centuries of study by serious archaeologists, we still don't have a confirmed, agreed-upon answer for exactly what they were used for. The knitting theory has real experimental backing behind it, and is one of the strongest current candidates. The measuring, candlestick, ceremonial, and gaming theories all have some circumstantial support and some serious problems. And it's entirely possible the true answer involves more than one use across more than one region and more than one century. What makes this a genuinely great mystery, rather than a manufactured one, is that it doesn't need any exaggeration to be fascinating. A vanished ancient civilization, a lost technology, a secret hidden on purpose, none of that is necessary here. What we actually have is simpler and in some ways stranger, an ordinary, well-documented ancient people who wrote down almost everything about their daily lives, who nonetheless left behind more than 100 copies of a beautifully made object and never once explained, in any surviving text, what it was for. Sometimes the most interesting unanswered question in history isn't the one wrapped in conspiracy. It's a one sitting quietly in a museum case with an honest little label that simply says, "Function unknown." If you've seen one of these in a museum, or if you have your own theory about what they might have been used for, I'd genuinely like to hear it in the comments, because this is one of those rare cases where an amateur guess is exactly as valid as an expert one, since nobody, expert or otherwise, actually has the answer yet.